Thank you, everybody, for being here. I'm Robin Priestley with the Ramsey County Historical Society. I'm going to turn it over to Peter Ratcliffe from the Eastside Freedom Library to say a few words, and then we'll introduce Chris and we'll get going. One thing while we get going, please make sure to turn off your videos and microphones during the program, and we'll see if we can turn those on at the end. So again, thank you, Peter.
Great. Thank you, Robin. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. And Chris, for putting this presentation together and sharing your work with us. I just want to mention a couple of things coming up on the calendar of the Eastside Freedom Library. On the 28th of September, we will be hosting a conversation with George Lakey and Minister Janae Bates on how to build solidarity around race and class. George is on a national book tour, and we're very excited to be having him at the library. And again, that will be hybrid. Also hybrid will be an event on October 5 with two of my favorite scholars or scholar activists, Robin Kelly from UCLA and Rod Ferguson from Yale. Both of them have the honor of having had books banned in the state of Florida. And they're going to talk about their work and the challenges posed by book banning and what we can all do about that. And again, that will be on October 5. And it will be both in person and remote. And then on October 19th, we will return to History Revealed, and we will be hearing from Professor Kate Bjork from the History Department at Hamlin, who will be presenting her just published book, Prairie Imperialists. And that is what the United States military and government learned from their repression of indigenous people in the Midwest and how that informed the behavior of the US military in the Philippines and other places, hence the title Prairie Imperialists. And again, that will be October 19. So please visit the Eastside Freedom Library's website, go to our events header so that you can register if you're interested in coming either in person or getting the Zoom link to watch remotely. And again, thank you all, and thank you, Robin, for your partnership. And also, we want to thank the Roseville Public Library for their partnership in these History Revealed programs. Robin, back to you.
Thanks, Peter. And I want to second the thank you to the Eastside Freedom Library and the Roseville Public Library as well. We've been doing these for a number of years now, and their support and partnership is invaluable for these programs. And I'll introduce Chris in just a second. I want to thank everybody who is a supporter or member of the Ramsey County Historical Society or the Eastside Freedom Library. Your support is invaluable. And please check out our website as well for upcoming programs. We have a couple of History Revealed programs this weekend, which in some ways are a continuation of what we're going to be talking about with Chris tonight. This is in partnership with the St. Paul Public Library. We're presenting a family history day with our curator, Molly Spillman, and some of the library's staff. They're going to be talking about the resources that are available to you when you're looking into your family history. And then they're also going to be doing a workshop. It's a registration only workshop to show you how you can digitize your family archives. So check out our website as well as the St. Paul Public Library website. I just want to remind everybody to keep your microphones and cameras turned off during the program. And the program is being recorded. It will be up on our RCHS and the Eastside Freedom Library YouTube channels in a few days. We would like to acknowledge the sacred Dakota land. Minnesota M.HSPH, the land where the waters are so clear they reflect the clouds, is the ancestral and contemporary homeland of the Dakota people. It is also home to the Anishinaabe and other indigenous peoples. RCHS acknowledges that its sites are located on and benefit from these sacred indigenous lands. RCHS is committed to preserving our past, informing our present, and inspiring our future. Part of doing so is acknowledging the painful history and current challenges facing the Dakota people as we celebrate the contributions of the Dakota and other Indigenous peoples. You can find our full land acknowledgement statement on our website. Again, it's www.rchs.com, and that includes actionable ways in which RCHS pledges to honor the Dakota and other Indigenous peoples of Minnesota, M.HSPH. So again, I'd like to thank Chris Rico for this presentation tonight. I've been really looking forward to it. Those of us who work with collections or work with people who work with collections, this is a really important topic. Chris is a public historian, archaeologist, and conservator with Nino Cultural Consultants here in St. Paul. He has a robust and diverse field of experience in heritage studies spanning over the last 6 years. Chris obtained his master's degree at the University of Minnesota in heritage studies and public history, and he's been working in various community development positions since then. And his breadth of experience includes extensive archival use, processing, research experience, and community-driven and engaged public history projects, oral histories, preservation, and special collections management. So, Chris, we really thank you for sharing your expertise with us tonight, and I'm going to turn it over to you. And again, thank you everybody for being here today.
Great. Thank you so much, Peter and Robin. I'm going to get my screen shared here. Okay, and I believe everybody should be able to see. If you can't, just call out. Again, I want to thank Robin and Peter and from the Eastside Freedom Library for inviting me to give a presentation tonight. As soon as I learned that I would be partnering, or we would be partnering with, or being sponsored by the Eastside Freedom Library, I kind of immediately decided what would be a good topic to kind of discuss my knowledge on and my kind of experience with. So I'm really excited. I think that this is a great opportunity to highlight some of the things that are going on in our local community in St. Paul, Minneapolis, pertaining to community archiving, community collections, and preservation. And lastly, I just want to especially thank Robin, who worked really hard to get me scheduled on this talk. It definitely wouldn't have been possible without her persistence, so I really appreciate that from Robin. You may notice that I kind of have a little amendment to the title of this presentation. I originally sent the title to Robin as you see it in the advertising for the program tonight. You can see here that I've added the M in parentheses to the end of it, preservation for whom. I was talking to some friends about how I would be putting on this presentation, and they asked me what the title was, and I said, you know, kind of connecting to collections preservation for who, and they said, you mean whom, right? And I kind of stopped for a second, and I was like, oh, I spelled that wrong, or, you know, I used the wrong who or whom. Definitely not the first time I've done something like that, but I decided to kind of just keep it that way. And I thought it would be kind of a good opportunity to demonstrate kind of what I feel like personally is kind of a spirit of community archiving or community preservation. No single person has all of the knowledge or has the know-how or the expertise to handle or take care of every little thing in a collection, or every little thing that goes into a community archive or what have you. It's a group effort. So I just wanted to kind of illustrate, or you take that opportunity to kind of illustrate that point. So a little bit about me. I kind of wear a lot of different hats in the heritage management field. As you heard from Robin, I do collections management, I do preservation, I'm an archaeologist. So a kind of a lot of different things. That all began with an internship at the Minnesota Historical Society in the Book and Paper Conservation Lab, which is just something that at the time I was a sophomore in college, it just kind of caught my eye out of the other options for interning at M.HSPH. If there's any college age people in here, or high school, or people who are in college right now looking for internship opportunities, the Minnesota Historical Society has some great opportunities, as well as I'm sure Ramsey County and I know East Side Freedom Library. Those are always good opportunities to take advantage of if you're in schooling. Anyway, that my experience kind of began serendipitously through that. It just caught my eye, and it was, you could apply for 3 positions, and that was just the one I happened to get an interview for and get accepted for, and that kind of opened up the door to heritage management to me, really. I really enjoyed working with Syra Hakai and Jenna Blum, the conservators at the time at the Minnesota Historical Society. And I learned a lot from them. And I really developed a love for working with history and historical objects or objects of the past. Through that experience, I was turned on to archaeology as a way to keep working with artifacts by hand. Being a conservator it's sort of hard to, I hesitate to call myself a conservator, but I also hesitate to not call myself a conservator. Experience levels kind of differ a lot. I haven't I've received for the last 6 years hands-on apprenticeship style training in book and paper conservation. But my skill set is that of an apprentice, sort of. I will not do advanced treatments involving chemicals and things like that to the projects that I work on. That is outside of my realm of expertise, and ethically, I cannot do work like that, or talk about work like that, because I don't know how to do it. Anyway, after the Historical Society, I was turned on to, I was attending the University of Minnesota, and through that experience at the Historical Society, I was able to get connected to the preservation department at Wilson Library at the University of Minnesota. Through that is really where I had a year at the Historical Society, and then 5 years at the University of Minnesota Collections Department. And there is where I really learned a lot about archival collections, 3D object collections, and just what goes on kind of behind the scenes in preservation. I've worked through that experience. I've worked in several repositories through the UMN, the Ames Southeast Asian Library, the Botanical Library, Anderson Library, which is just kind of another name for the university archives. Within that, specifically the Treader Collection, which is an LGBTQ plus themed collection at the university, and the university archives. I've also worked quite extensively in the Wangenstein Biomedical Library. That is more of a 3D object experience. And then the rest of my experience really has to do with, like I said, book and paper conservation. So sort of collections management in terms of organizing, auditing, and all those things, all those fun things that come with managing a collection, as well as the other half being working to physically preserve those collections. Also, I have an extensive interest and experience in archival research or collections research, specifically focusing on the University of Minnesota's wild rice or monoman research. I basically went into the university archives and condensed the last 50, 60 years of research on wild rice at the university, and was able to reveal a lot of sort of revelations about how that program started, its effect on indigenous communities who hold Monoman in sacred regard and rely on it for their well-being. The effects of that research on those communities, and where it's at today. And that is an example of a project that really kind of made me fall in love with the idea of kind of reinterpreting, maybe not necessarily reinterpreting, but looking at archives from a different angle than one might traditionally think about. So what are we going to get into today? It's going to be a little bit of a hodgepodge, to be honest. Like I said, when Robin first contacted me about doing a program with Ramsey County, in speaking with cultural consultants and kind of what would be a good fit in terms of what I could do during a little bit of work time, we were thinking of focusing on my conservation experience. And then a little later, when I found out Eastside Freedom Library would be co-sponsoring the event, and me being me, just kind of the education I've received, the training I've received in the Heritage Studies and Public History program, I thought it would be a shame to only talk about kind of the practices or the happenings of preservation. I thought it would be much more appropriate to take a critical view, sort of my understanding, my training of modern collecting and collections praxis, or the practice, or putting sort of historical theory and thought of archival organization and practice into practice. So that'll kind of cover the first part of tonight, looking at a critical view of modern collecting and collections. Our sort of segue in the middle of that will be a so what? Why does this matter? Why am I telling you, or why did I think it is important to talk about this in a lecture on preservation? The second topic will be kind of breaking away into, again, the sort of theme I'm thinking for tonight is kind of at-home preservation, or preserving your own treasures within your community, or your family, or etc., however you define community. So that being said, we're going to kind of cover some diverse topics. So I think we'll be able to put questions in the chat if you have them, and we'll be able to go over those at the end. So with that said, we'll just kind of get into it. And the first, I kind of want to start with this quote: "Memory is not something found or collected." Oh, actually, I should start off by, you're going to see the word archives a lot in this presentation, and I'm using that somewhat interchangeably with collections. You'll see sometimes specifically, like in this quote, talking about archives, but I really feel that a lot of what I'm talking about and a lot of the kind of theory that I'll be covering applies just as well to 3D object collections, or what have you, as it does to archival or book and paper collections. So memory is not something found or collected in archives or collections. It's something that is made and continually remade. And what do we mean by that? So archives and records, or archiving, record keeping, collecting, and those two things go hand in hand. Going back, they go far back to, I mean, even before pre-modern times, but I'm really going to be talking about our modern kind of interpretation on collecting and archiving. And this quote is kind of meant to illustrate the idea that collections will always reflect power relationships. Collections are not passive. They're not storehouses of old things. They're active. There is power constantly being negotiated, contested, and confirmed within collections, and that contestation is constantly changing and dynamic with the way that the collections change, and what I mean by that being the way that the physical collection changes, the what is being collected or what is deemed as being mission critical to that institution to being collected will change over time, or the difference in the objects coming in will renegotiate those power relationships within the collection. Additionally, the people who work in the archives, the sort of, and we'll get into this, the people behind the curtains, are not neutral. And again, and that also applies to obviously the collection or the archive. They are not neutral, although coming back to kind of the introduction of archives and collecting within the context of the modern era is something that has its roots in colonialism and empire. And it's something that we, as archivists, as collections managers, as conservators, must be continually aware of. And again, reinforcing the idea that these are not neutral spaces. They are informed by practices of empire and colonialism. So I kind of have this, a lot of what we'll be going over is some theory and things like that that I learned during my time in my master's program at the University of Minnesota, and I will have a resource to share with everyone at the end where you can kind of look at these same readings that I looked at to put together this presentation. The invisible collection is this kind of idea, or the invisible archive is kind of this metaphor, if you will, of illustrating the kind of mystery of collections. And this is an idea that really resonated with me when I first started taking kind of collection and archival theory more seriously, or taking those classes and engaging with that material more, because it is, and I'm sure so many of you can empathize with this, such a nebulous thing to think about, a collection or an archive, from who the archive is about or who is represented in the archive, to, again, who is taking care of the archive, who is making decisions about what is collectible or archivable and what isn't, what is valuable and what isn't. These are all ideas that kind of go into this notion of the invisible collection. And again, going back to the formative years of the profession of archiving or collecting or managing collections, there was an expected objective. There was the idea of the neutral archive as the basis for objective, scientific, fact-based history being written. And I think that this is very much still true today. This being influenced by hierarchies of colonialism or Western ideas. And what I mean by Western, European, North American, primarily, ideas of the need to organize things, to create hierarchies in order to, in the Western purview, better understand the world around them, or and that often we hear an argument, or you may hear the other side of that is indigenous epistemology or indigenous ways of knowing, not necessarily not necessarily being radically different from science or Western ideas of science, but rather, I guess the best way that I can think to put it is just coming at it from a different angle. Just because maybe there's not such an emphasis on in a different way of knowing, a non-Western way of knowing, maybe there's not such an emphasis on organization and hierarchy. Maybe the emphasis is on the content of the archive itself. And we'll get into what I mean by that a little bit in the next few slides. The idea again of this invisible collection in modern collecting, this idea, another kind of phrase that really resonated with me in my studies by Judith Butler is this idea of social magic. And this really is an idea that applies to, again, the kind of idea of collecting, the idea of a collection or an archive. The social magic applying to that, again, what I was kind of talking about with the invisible collection, the nebulous nature of a collection and what goes into it, and especially who takes care of it. Judith Butler kind of posits this, that archivists and collections managers perform or put on a performance that becomes, and this performance being going back to these hierarchies of colonialism, the performance being the organization, the organization, and just kind of imposing that archival training, that strict Western neutral, the idea of the neutral archive, of the archive being used for strictly for information, scientific purposes, humanistic or humanities purposes, the advancement of this, that, and the other thing. These all what goes into kind of maintaining an archive or a collection, building descriptions, appraising a collection, etc., are all part of this social magic that becomes, again, embedded in this process of collecting and collections. So it begins to work both ways, in that the archivist believes or takes on this kind of persona or this role as the arbiter of information, and on the other side of the coin, the public willingly kind of or happily goes along with that that idea, and also sees it as a sort of magic, if you will. And again, speaking for myself, that's something that really resonated with me, because I've always looked at, before I myself became a collections manager, or someone who worked behind the curtain, I always saw it as a very exotic, hard to understand, monolithic, big thing. So what's behind the curtain? Kind of coming into, again, modern understandings or imperialistic understandings of archiving and collecting. Records and collections are, again, due to this kind of this social magic and this tradition, if you will, being baked into the process of maintaining archives and collections. To this day, many still kind of have almost like an addiction or a bad habit. And maybe that's not the right way to put it either, but for lack of a better term, still sticking to these ideals of order and truths about these collections, revealing about their creators or their communities and things like that. The act of ordering them, the idea is that the act of ordering them is what is producing these truths or revealing these truths, not the content itself. Again, something we'll focus on in a little bit. So, and this is a good opportunity to bring up, I was trying to find some images of this exhibit online that I couldn't. Another really great, if anybody has seen this exhibit or has some time coming up to go to the Science Museum of Minnesota, if it's still there, a great exhibit that kind of illustrates the power imbalances or the power relationships within collections and archives is an exhibit called We Move and We Stay. This is a exhibit on Dakota tradition and Dakota peoples and history in their homeland here of Minnesota. There's a particular exhibit case in that exhibit that is empty. It only has a few it has labels of the objects that used to be held in it, as well as the mounts, what we call in the biz mounts, or what are used to kind of hold an object for display. All that's left in this display case are the mounts and the labels, and the purpose of this, as I interpreted it, is to illustrate to the public this power imbalance. On the labels in the exhibit, it explains why it's an empty case, and it's because the objects that had been in there previously were found out to be, or later on the museum curators were informed by Dakota communities that these objects were sacred, holy, religious objects, that it is sacrilegious or disrespectful to be putting them on display for anybody and everybody to see. The museum responded by eventually taking those objects out of display and leaving their display case with the mounts and the labels to, again, kind of illustrate these power imbalances, or these power relationships going on inside of collections. So there's the again, just to illustrate what I mean by that for everyone, is there's originally the idea to collect these Dakota artifacts because they will give it'll be for the betterment of humanity as a whole, to know this information about the Dakota people, to be able to see these religious objects and things like that. The museum, or the traditional thinking, is that we have to display these things. It's our obligation to the public to display these things. And getting into postmodern kind of archival and collecting theory, that is what that exhibit is displaying, is that postmodern kind of interpretation of, the story, or the important part of these objects or these artifacts. It's not the objects themselves, it's what the objects can it's the substance of the objects. And for me, the museum is kind of molding that substance, or reinterpreting the substance of those objects to display, kind of, like I said, this new thinking in collecting, and really visualize this dichotomy between this colonial imperialistic ideas of archiving and collecting, and juxtapose it with this empty display case meant to represent a more modern, postmodern interpretation of archiving and collecting. But again, on the flip side of that, and we'll get into this in the so what, at the end of the day, the institution is still the one that holds the power in that relationship, in that specific example between those. The Science Museum is still the legal owner of those artifacts, of those objects. Broadly speaking, I can't say if those exact artifacts were repatriated or if they still exist within the collection and just aren't displayed. But that again goes into this kind of colonial empire understanding of archiving and collecting, and that it's a duty to protect it. There's an idea of, we're the only one who can preserve this the way it should be preserved or has to be preserved for information for the public, whereas an indigenous perspective might be that this was never meant to be preserved at all. Maybe this was a funerary object that was meant to forever remain in the earth. So these kind of, again, just to illustrate these kind of two sort of dichotomies or opposing sides, and that's kind of where I feel like we're at right now. We're kind of in the profession, we're navigating between this old way of doing things, or this old understanding of doing things, and trying to recognize how that has been baked into the way that we practice things today, and then on the other side, interrogating that and working with communities to come up with better approaches to preserving history. It doesn't have to necessarily be collected, or it doesn't have to be a 3D object or what have you. The meaning is the meaning. The object itself is meaningless without the context given to it by its culture or community. So again, a lot of these, speaking specifically to the practice of archiving, a lot of information on indigenous peoples and things like that were recorded as a part of, or kind of as a function of governance, of government. Or for instance, behind me, these books are the collection of the Bureau of Ethnography, which was a congressionally mandated kind of bureau in the 1800s and early 1900s that went around the country, mainly collecting indigenous histories and information about indigenous peoples, because at the time the belief was these people are not gonna, these cultures are not gonna exist in 100 years because we're working to assimilate them and et cetera, et cetera. So we need to collect all of this information from them before they're gone and it's lost forever. Again, that is kind of how a lot of this information and these objects have come to be in the ownership of places like historical societies and archiving and collecting institutions. This kind of government mandated collecting, going back again to the ideas of empire and colonialism. So preservation for whom or who? Why does it matter? Why am I spending so much time here kind of breaking down some of what I really think are some really complex debates going on kind of behind the scenes of museums and collecting? What's the kind of point of illustrating all of this? And again, it's going into just using, I've done a lot of work in my profession with indigenous communities, specifically Ojibwe communities in Minnesota and wild rice. And so that's where a lot of the base of my knowledge comes from, and why I keep kind of referencing these examples. But again, these are some quotes pulled for some readings that I'll share with you at the end, but just to illustrate this kind of these competing interests that really frankly are raging behind the scenes of collections and collecting institutions. So many indigenous people, or people of different cultures even, in general, view archival records, or people from, for instance, old places of colonialism. This applies to them as well as indigenous records or record keeping. View archival records containing information about themselves, family, or community as being indigenous records. These, due to the history associated with colonialism and empire and the genocide associated with that. Today, indigenous communities are extremely, rightfully so, protective of their culture and things relating to their past, because of the systematic destruction of it. So these objects, this information being held in archives, again, creates a very serious point of contention between, or a very dynamic power imbalance between the collecting institutions and the communities that they are collecting from, or how collecting institutions might put it, collecting for instead of from, collecting for. Again, this idea of the museum being in a kind of colonial view of the museum being the only place that is right, or the only place that a collection can be stored. It can't be stored anywhere else because nobody can take care of it as well, or nobody knows how to take care of it as well. That kind of idea being baked into, again, collecting institutions. On the other hand, on the other side of this coin, archival institutions, in particular, again, government institutions, going back again to some of my illustrations, have received the records as documents of government operation, and they view those records as belonging to them. But these records, again, just illustrating or going back to that, the importance of or why this is such a contentious issue for so many of these communities, because of the legacy of colonialism and empire, and the genocide associated with that, and the erasure and removal associated with that. These kinds of records and remnants from those communities can profoundly shape identity and aspirations, and can also provide a mandate for action in the contemporary. And again, going back to what makes this so contentious, this idea of collecting, why can it be such a contentious topic? Again, going to the law, to the indigenous people, the loss of ancestral land and historical knowledge, the history of delegitimization, loss of cultural heritage and cultural expressions, all purposefully and systematically wiped out by colonial powers, Western powers, the remnants of which exist in collections and archives. And it is, I'm sure, given that explanation, you might be able to understand why there is such contention, or there can be such contention behind repatriation and ownership of those objects and that information. And having access to that information is one thing, but having control of that information allows communities to know their family background, and reconnect with places and cultures of their people in a way that makes sense to them, in a way that is not, again, of thinking of what goes on behind the curtain, the invisible archive. There is somebody appraising the value of collections. There is somebody organizing the collections. And through those actions, they are imprinting their interpretations onto that collection, and they are thereby changing or have the potential to kind of change the interpretation or manipulate the interpretation of that collection, that item, that archive, etc. Again, just re-illustrating, this all has the power to profoundly shape a community's identity and aspirations, and can provide a mandate for action. And so this is kind of transitioning into, this is probably familiar to some of you, if you, and I know Peter for sure, Robin. This is an image from inside the East Side Freedom Library. Kind of transitioning now into a little bit more into our kind of postmodern archival thinking. This thinking requires the profession, or it requires collectors, collections, being institutional collections, institutional collectors, and etc. It requires these people, these professions, to accept that they cannot escape the sub-performance. Again, performance being this idea of social magic, this performance of the arbiter of information. They cannot escape the subjectivity of that performance by claiming the objectivity of systems and standards. So they can't, what that means is they can't claim, we can't claim that collections and archives as we understand them in a Western sense are neutral spaces. They are inherently affected by various, even the archivist's own personal experiences have an influence on how that archivist, or may have an influence on how that archivist chooses to arrange, appraise, or audit a collection or an item. And so again, getting into kind of advancing more into postmodern thinking on archives. And this is really, in my impression, thankfully, a very widespread understanding of archives and collecting today. The trickier part comes with following through or executing on coming up with different ways of collecting or organizing collections, and etc. So there's this, so what I mean by that is there's this dichotomy in archives right now where on one hand, archives being heritage places with documentary records that that contextualize historical memory and culture, but on another hand, being constrained by the bureaucratic administrative hierarchy and government responsibility to government authority and public accountability, being the tension right now is between those two things. How do we create more rich, diverse understandings or ways of knowing and administering collections and things like that? Between it's the idea, I mean, the best way that I always think of it is, and a question that we constantly wrestle with as kind of postmodern thinkers, can you dismantle the maker's house with the maker's tools? And that's kind of what this dichotomy that I'm getting at is kind of illustrating, where on one hand, collections are these places of heritage, historical memory, and culture, but on the other hand, they are hamstrung by the methods that have been baked into our understanding of organization and how to our understandings of collecting and archiving. So again, that's just to say, where we're at today and why I'm highlighting specifically the East Side Freedom Library, not just because they're a partnering sponsor on this talk, but because I think they're one of a handful of institutions or community institutions in the Twin Cities really leading the way on this idea of power recognized becoming power that can be questioned, power that can be made accountable and open to transparent dialogue and enriched understanding. That's really what I'm trying to get at on this first half of the presentation, is being able to recognize the strings that are behind the scenes, being able to peer behind the curtain, being able to make the invisible collection visible, is what places like East Side Freedom Library, the Sumal House of Art, are two examples that I'll go into in this presentation. These are two institutions really leading the way, I believe, in Minnesota and the Twin Cities on speaking truth to power and how doing that coincides or we can kind of use that in conjunction with reforming the way we collect and the way we archive and the way we think about those things. So a quote from the kind of About Us section on the East Side Freedom Library, and I think, again, this is such a, I really like, it, half of me says I'm kind of lazy for just going on the About Us part of East Side Freedom Library and pasting it into here, but the other part of me is it just really contextualizes a lot of what I advocate in for my work in my profession and what I was taught to advocate for and trained to do in my graduate program. So story is a major theme of the East Side Freedom Library, and the telling and gathering of stories through formal interviews, workshops, small-scale public performances, etc., will allow residents and interested publics to learn more about the work and residential histories of the East Side. The latter half of that, that kind of About Us, I'd like to add some of my own interpretations of what story, or focusing on the content of the collection rather than the collection itself. Focusing on the story has the power to allow local residents and interested publics to not just learn more about the history of their community, but take an active role in disseminating and interpreting that history, and I hesitate to say it because it just sounds kind of cliche, but becoming that history and becoming the new or creating that new understanding or that new practice of collecting in opposition to what we traditionally know as or through colonialism and empire. So my own kind of knowledge of some of the East Side Freedom Library's programming are things like we were talking, Rob and Peter and I were talking about the Dear Neighbor exhibit, or I think it was an exhibit, the Dear Neighbor project or program, which was done with East Side Freedom Library, and just kind of looking at mapping prejudice, another project that a lot of you might be familiar with in the Twin Cities. East Side Freedom Library focusing on things that matter to their community or the community that they serve. And this is a question that or a discussion that is had in every museum and every institution multiple times a day, a week, a month, a year, is who is our audience? Who are we collecting for? Who is our community, and how are we serving them? For smaller organizations like East Side Freedom Library and more community centered institutions. I think personally, there's much more room to make a meaningful connection with the community that they are in, as opposed to a place like the Minnesota Historical Society, which is responsible for the entire state. It can be kind of subjective on how you look at community, who serves who, and etc. But these smaller institutions, I feel like, are the larger institutions like the Minnesota Historical Society could take lessons and et cetera from some of these smaller institutions. And as I say that, I realize it's not that simple, but we won't get too into the weeds on that right now. But basically being this idea that programming which matters to the resident community, which is impacting the resident community. And part of that is going out to that resident community and inviting them in for things like workshops and, public storytelling and sharing sessions and things like that. These different ways of collecting cultural information, narrative, etc., rather than through objects and hierarchy and idea of the fruitfulness of information for information's sake. Another something, this is a kind of in progress exhibit right now. My fellow cohort member, Camille Hader, is a co-director at the Sumal House of Art, which is a community art center in Minneapolis, in Minneapolis, centered on the Somali community in the area. They are currently working on a sort of fellowship, or they are paying 2 community members to do this transmigrating cassette tape project on their community. And I think this is this is a really great example, I think, of again, kind of an maybe alternative isn't the right way to put it, but a different way of approaching collecting and collections. The very act of so the kind of background of this exhibit is the Somali diaspora in the US really has not, they really haven't, they're kind of going through the same struggle right now as indigenous communities and other disadvantaged communities. They don't have agency over their own history because of these power imbalances and things like that that I've been talking about present within collecting institutions. The particular women who are working on this project, transmigrating cassettes, themselves, during a presentation I went to last week, they are going to an archive in New York, and which has a lot of Ellis Island information on it. I'm not exactly, I can't quite recall the name of the archive, but they asked the curator, what's been done with this, with these histories, and it's a wide variety of photographs and diaries and things like that. Anything you'd expect in a collection or an archive from a community. They asked what the curator, what has been, what's been done with these collections, who's engaging with them, and he flat out said, "You're the first one ever to engage with these collections." And again, I think that speaks to the inaccessibility that these hierarchies and these power imbalances create to archives. So Somali immigrants are unable to access this information because they don't even know it exists. because of the way that it has been collected and organized and appraised. And also just this, I think that this is a really interesting idea of collecting on a cassette tape on an obsolete piece of or what we would think of as an obsolete piece of technology, that, you know, a very ephemeral piece of technology. And that's kind of the point of the exhibit. Anyway, I'm getting a little in the weeds. Let's talk about preserving your treasures. So with all of this that I'm kind of, there's some of you may be wondering why, you know, I just spent the majority of my time kind of talking about these issues, these kind of complex theory issues within archives and collections and collecting institutions. And the point of that is to kind of illustrate the point, or further illustrate a point that, you know, we all have personal collections, we all have personal treasures, and we are, you know, capable of taking care of those things ourselves and handling them ourselves, and being the creators of these objects, you know, these family heirlooms, or the inheritors of these family heirlooms. We are the ones, we, you know, kind of figuratively speaking, are the ones who apply the meaning to these objects, and therefore we are capable, or rightfully so, should be the ones taking care of these, or can be the ones taking care of these. I'm not trying to disparage collecting or collecting institutions necessarily. More, you know, I'm not trying to say don't donate your things to institutions and things like that. More, be aware that you have options. You know, you don't have to donate everything. You don't have to donate anything at all. But if you want to donate, you know, personal, cultural, family things, there are other places besides the Historical Society, or there are other options where, instead of kind of going into the abyss or the setting sun, your kind of treasures can be much more actively applied or used. Stabilization is the name of the game, and in collecting and archiving institutions, you will hear the same thing. This is pretty much, conservation is stabilization. Mostly 90% of, at least in my experience, book and paper conservation. It gets a little different when you get into 3D objects and different 3D objects, and like archaeology, for instance. There can be a lot of chemical and technical things done to those objects, but for book and paper and the vast majority of 3D objects, 90%, I would say, of what preservation is just stabilization. Just finding a nice, consistently temperate, dry place to store your treasures or your things. The other 10%, and, you know, maybe only 5% of that 10% is you know, doing extensive complex repairs, or you know, using chemicals to restore this and that, or rebinding and things like that. Stabilization is the name of the game, and if you're looking to preserve your collections at home, I feel like going into this, some people might think, or, you know, have an impression of some of the things in their collections that, you know, if I donated this to a museum, they would probably do this, that, and the other thing. They would, you know, do some chemical treatment to it and I guess I should say, I'm speaking for myself. These are kind of my own interpretations of collections and the field before, again, I got to kind of step behind the curtain. is they're doing all these like really complex, like they got the magnifying glass and the tweezers and the and you know, it's super precise, complex. No, all it is, the mass majority of it is finding a stable place to store your objects. And so just illustrating two very common kinds of enclosures or protective enclosures that I made personally for some objects at the University of Minnesota. On the left here is an image of an encapsulated map. Encapsulation is it looks like laminating, but it is not laminating. Do not ever or I would strongly advise against laminating any of your personal paper collections. Instead, encapsulating it in Mylar. Laminating essentially melts plastic or melts the material to what it is encasing or binding. It's an irreversible process. Once you laminate something, you cannot delaminate it and have it be the same as it was before. With encapsulating, it is just sandwiching your paper object between two pieces of Mylar. In museums and institutions, usually they are sealed shut by, believe it or not, a sonic or like a sonic encapsulator. So they use sound to essentially weld the Mylar together. What I do myself and what a lot of other folks do will use double-sided tape instead, because you know we don't have access to the tens of thousands of dollars that it takes to get a sonic encapsulator. Double stick tape, you know, on one hand, I'll tell you, you should never put tape near any object because of the acidity and the of tape and the potential for it to mess up that object. But another big part of conservation and preservation, community preservation and conservation, is working with what we got. And that's something that I feel comfortable. It's something that I've used here at NCC. It's something that I was taught by the conservators who trained me to kind of assess the object and work with what you got. Keeping in mind, and we'll get to this in the next slide, that anything that you do to an object should be 100% reversible. Anything that you want to or plan to do to an object should be able to be undone and the object be as it was exactly before the treatment was done. That is probably the biggest reason in my mind why stabilization is the name of the game, because stabilization typically or really does not involve making changes making irreversible changes to the object. If you choose to encapsulate something in Mylar versus laminating it, all you have to do is peel apart the pieces of Mylar and take the piece of paper out. If you laminate it, again, you can't separate it. Maybe you can get the laminate off, but some of it off, but the paper is going to come with it or whatever. There's going to be damage. Same with this. This is a deluxe phase box on the right. This is just a really tightly made box. You can see there is no room for this, the War of the Nations portfolio, this book. There's no room for it. Once this clamshell box or this phase box is closed, the book is solid within that box. There's no space for it to kind of wiggle and jostle and things like that. The best treatment for this object is to just put it in a box. Repair is something that kind of can toe a line, and a lot of what I did at the University of Minnesota was repair with the idea of stabilization in mind. Repairing objects kind of we kind of toe a line sometimes between kind of towing a line between doing something to an object that is irreversible or that is a significant change to the object while still being reversible. All of the kind of examples here on this slide on the top left. This is one of the books behind me being rebound into a cloth case binding. And then on the right here is an image of kind of my specialty in book and paper conservation, and that's paper repair, mending tears. These are all ways, or technically ways, of stabilization. And all of these are the materials that I use in these repairs are reversible. So the glue that I use in, for instance, on the books here is water soluble glue. If I wanted to, I keep all of the old cases. Essentially what I did was, these are leather bound books in their current form. In speaking with my client, the owner of NCC, we decided the best way to preserve what we are interested in with these objects is the kind of the scientific knowledge, if you will. We use them a lot in our report writing and things like that. We're interested in the data inside of them. We're not interested necessarily in the binding. So in consultation with Jeremy, the owner, we decided to rebind them in a cloth case. That being said, if I wanted to debind or disbind it from the cloth case, I have still saved the old leather. I have saved the old boards. The materials and the processes that I'm using in these repairs are reversible. Again, this is a personal or a private object, with the understanding, or done in consultation with Jeremy or the owner, with the understanding that what we care about this object is the data that it contains specifically. Getting a little bit more into stabilization repairs. A common, a lot of us have older books. A common thing that happens is the hinges on these books get frayed. They're kind of simple bindings, and simply picking up or opening it up too fast could result in the cover being ripped off, or the spine being ripped off, or serious damage happening. In the case of things like textbooks, book and paper objects, we are usually thinking about, or we are usually conserving with the data that is inside in mind. Now that changes, that kind of idea of what is important about the object changes with what the object is, or what it is to us, the conservator, or the person repairing it, or what it is to the collection that houses it. So for these at the University of Minnesota and Wilson Library, a lot of the repairs are of book spines and things like that, making sure that we're not going to lose pages out of the book, that the spine is going to be, we repair the spine so that it's stiffer, so that the cover, we recase it so that the cover won't tear off, or et cetera. And again, we I don't have a good picture of it, but while I am cutting off the spine, you can see in the third image to the right on this slide, you can see I have separated the spine from the book. I am reattaching that spine, or the spine is reattached in this final picture. The only thing that, so the information from the spine is reattached. The only thing that has been replaced is the material that is binding the book together, and not even necessarily replaced. It's just been kind of moved around a little bit, if you will. An incision made on the book. We put new material for the spine and kind of tucked it into the existing cloth, and then put the existing cloth spine back over it to make it as original to the original as possible. So this is something that I want to, and that I've been kind of hinting at, talking a little bit about throughout this talk, and this is kind of what I mean by I hesitate to call, sometimes I hesitate to call myself a professional conservator, but at the same time, I feel comfortable calling myself a professional conservator because of the this kind of these what I'll be outlining in this kind of by or illustrating by bringing up this code of ethics. So a conservation professional, and I guess I'm putting this slide up with the hope that you'll think of yourself maybe as a conservator of your own, a professional conservator of your own collections and etc. And keeping in mind that we don't want to do irreversible things or irreversible damage or what have you to our collection. So the conservation professional or the person working on the object or what have you should or shall practice within the limits of personal competence and education, as well as within the limits of available facilities. That's why here at NCC, I will not do any, pretty much the only thing I will, or the most intensive treatments I will do are recasing and doing paper repair, mending tears. The rest of everything I do is making protective enclosures and stabilizing. Again, stabilization, name of the game. The conservation of this sixth, again, just kind of cherry picked these two from the larger list. Number 6, the conservation professional must strive to select methods and materials that, to the best of current knowledge, do not adversely affect cultural property or its future examination, scientific investigation, treatment, or function. Again, you can kind of see this, again, this tension that I've been talking about playing out here in this code of ethics. We're talking about the thing that is stressed in this code of ethics is the future examination, the scientific investigation, or the function of the object. Again, we're kind of stuck on the usefulness in a Western sense, or in a certain epistemological sense, the usefulness of the object rather than the meaning of the object, which is what other epistemologies would have us or would want us to concentrate on, rather than the organization of the object itself. So storage and environment is another big is pretty much the other half of stabilization, or stabilization is the base of stabilization. The other thing you should be really concerned about, and I'll be wrapping up here very shortly. I just took a look at the time and realized I'm running a little late. Is making really well-made, tight-fitting enclosures for your objects. Always look for acid-free materials. Those will usually, when you're looking for materials to enclose your items in or etc., it will say if it is acid-free. If it doesn't specifically say it's acid-free, don't assume it probably will have an acidic effect on the object that you place in it. Again, if it does not specifically say acid-free, an enclosure that you use may have an acidic effect on the object that you're putting in it after a prolonged amount of time. And again, environment, depending on the object, obviously temperature might change a little bit, but typically you want to keep it at a consistent temperature, room temperature. You don't want to store things in the attic. You don't want to store things in the basement where humidity is constantly fluctuating, temperature is fluctuating with the season. You want to find a dark place, maybe on the first level of your house, where it's not going to fluctuate in temperature and climate and humidity a whole lot, out of sunlight. Sunlight and climate are going to be the two of the most adverse effects to your objects. So yeah, and just some examples of some enclosures that again, that I've made during my time at the university and during my time at NCC. This is really, and I hope I'm not disappointing anybody by just talking a lot about box making and enclosures on taking care of your personal treasures, but that's really what, like I said, a lot of professional conservatism is stabilization and just finding a good place to store your object. You can see here, this is an archival box, and then I just made myself some little cardboard cutouts in here to kind of be able to separate or organize or keep, maybe another thing is, again, all paper, unless it specifically says it is acid-free, is acidic and will break itself down after given long enough and the right environmental conditions. Creating separators like this within your enclosures ensures that those pieces of paper aren't touching each other and acidifying each other. Again, leather objects in this middle picture are enclosed in an acid-free enclosure and separated from each other. They're not touching physically. The leather is not touching itself. This picture on the far right, a very tightly made enclosure that book inside is not moving around. Same with this last one. And again, just illustrating the benefits of encapsulating paper materials. You can see here on this top picture, I'm taking my finger and kind of making a crease on this object while it's encapsulated. You can see on the bottom picture, the encapsulation, the support that the Mylar gives to the object inside allows it to bounce right back. The crease does not stay in it. You can, I wouldn't recommend doing this, but a fun kind of example that we always did at the Minnesota Historical Society was we would encapsulate a piece of paper, and when we were giving tours of the lab, we'd take it and we'd crumple the whole thing up and then let it go, and it would inevitably come back to its original shape. That's not always going to, that's not necessarily always going to happen, but it just contextualizes the benefits of Mylar over nothing or laminating. And then I just want to kind of end on, again, I just want to end on kind of some alternative methods, or what we might think of alternative methods of collecting, archiving, our family treasures, our histories. Oral history is maybe not even necessarily alternative method isn't the right description for oral histories, but because they're becoming more and more accepted and widely used as a form of preservation. But in speaking to a smaller community, to your families, oral histories can be family stories and things like that. So and so did this when they were growing up, and kind of keeping that story. Maybe it's every Christmas, every year, grandpa always says the same story. That is a form of preservation. Tradition. Something my mom did for me and my me and my sisters, which is she made up her own tradition when we were kids. When the year 2000 rolled around, she made up this thing called the Millennium Fairy, and she left the Millennium Fairy left presents for us on New Year's. And my mom later in my life said she did that so we would always remember the year 2000, because we were, I think I was like 5 years old in 2000. So if my mom hadn't made that up, I would not have ever, and I have a very specific, vivid image of this time in my life thanks to that tradition that my mom kind of made up. Memory. What do I mean by memory? Again, kind of reminiscing, storytelling with your family. That is a form of preservation. A lot of the things I'm sure that the East Side Freedom Library does, and other places, workshops and things like that, storytelling and story sharing sessions are also effective and valid ways of collecting and preserving your family treasures. And I just encourage you to think creatively about preservation. What else? What else might constitute an effective preservation tool? And with that, I'm pretty much wrapped up. I apologize that I kind of started whipping through things at the end as I realized I was running out of time. I wanted to share this list of resources with you, and I will put a link in the chat here in just a second as soon as I stop sharing, of products that you can buy online to store your personal collections in, trainings to where you can make your own enclosures. I use a lot of these trainings myself to teach myself how to make new enclosures or do new bindings and things like that. And then if you're nervous about doing things yourself, or if you have something that you're like, this really needs to be seen by a professional conservator, or like a museum level conservator, there's also a link to pretty much every registered conservator in the country that has a personal kind of conservation service. It's a directory for those people. So I'm going to stop the share, and then I'm going to grab that link real quick and share it in the chat, just so y'all have it.
Thank you, Chris, for this. This was really interesting and important information. And again, I want to let everybody know again on the weekend, check out our website, rchs.com, for those programs with the Central Library on resources for your family history, as well as digitizing. If you want to go that route, some people don't, and some people do want to digitize their family archives and treasures. So there's Chris's link. Oh, that just came to me, Chris. You want to give it to everybody?
Oops.
So there was a question from Alexandra that maybe we can cover quickly. And we'll go a little bit over if everybody's okay with that. How do you personally grapple with ideas of colonialism and power in your professional career? I know that's a big question, and we appreciate that from Alexandra. I think we all have to consider that.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of yeah, it's a lot. The things that come to my mind immediately are being aware of the positionality that we have, or I should say, speaking for myself, that I have as a white cis male settler descendant, always acknowledging that that ancestry or that history, acknowledging that privilege, and being humble being understanding when I get called out on things. I've been called out by Indigenous communities before for not frankly not taking their considerations seriously enough. Not purposefully, obviously, but I was told pretty straightforward that we don't think that you're the best fit for us based on what et cetera, et cetera, we've had in this conversation. And when you are faced with that kind of a response from an Indigenous person or somebody who has a legacy with this colonialism, not brushing that off, understanding that these are painful, complex histories and systems, and they're going to make you upset, and they're going to make other people upset, and we have to be nimble, empathetic, and understanding when that happens.
Thanks, Chris. Are there any other questions or comments that people have you can put in the chat? If not, what we can do is I want to thank Chris and the East Side. Oh, there's one more. I want to thank Chris and the East Side Freedom Library. And what I'll do is, Peter, if you want to say a few last words, then I'll turn off the recording and we can turn people's microphones back on and we can share a little bit before we get too late in the evening. we want to be conscious of Chris's time as well as your time.
I just want to thank Chris, and I didn't know he was going to show images of the East Side Freedom Library and talk about us. And I feel we were well represented by how he incorporated us into his presentation. So thank you for that, Chris. And I want to invite everyone to not only attend our programs online, but come visit the East Side Freedom Library. We are currently in a project, maybe Chris, you would be interested, could offer some advice. We are trying to catalog and organize thousands of union buttons and protest buttons that we don't know, as the Antiques Roadshow people would say, we don't know the provenance of all of it. It just came in bags as if someone left them on our front stoop. And we have a couple of wonderful MLIS library grad students from St. Kate's who are working with them. And it's a joy to see these objects now coming out, and now we have to figure out how to talk to them and have them talk to our visitors. So that's an exciting new project that we're doing that I think would be right up your alley. So Robin, shall we ask people to turn on their videos and
I wanna
mics if they'd like?
Yeah, thank you all again. Check out our website, as well as the East Side Freedom Library's website for upcoming programs. We will be having, in addition to the program that we mentioned, there will also be an Oakland Cemetery tour coming up in October with Denise Donald Wells. And so some of you may have ancestors that are there. So that will be a fun program. So again, thank you all for being here. We will see you at another program soon.